Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're venturing into the extraordinary life of Sir Isaac Newton, a name synonymous, really, with scientific revolution.
Absolutely.
Born back in the winter of 1642, that's using the old Julian calendar, so early January 1643, for us now, this English genius just fundamentally reshaped how we see the cosmos.
His contributions are, well, they're truly foundational, aren't they? We're talking about classical mechanics,
Right.
pioneering work in optics, and, of course, his huge role in developing infinitesimal calculus.
Yeah, that mathematical language that, underpins so much of modern science and tech.
Exactly.
So to explore this towering figure, we've got a really detailed source, the Vietnamese Wikipedia entry on Isaac Newton. Our mission, I guess, is to pull out the most compelling, maybe even surprising insights into this scientific titan.
It's fascinating, actually, to see how a figure like Newton is documented, across different languages and cultures. Wikipedia can be quite good at synthesizing that widely accepted knowledge.
Absolutely. And Newton's life, well, it started with some real drama. Born prematurely, apparently so small, his mother said he could fit into a quart mug.
Wow.
And tragically, his father, also Isaac, died 3 months before he was even born. A pretty fragile start for someone who leaves such a mark. A delicate beginning, yeah. It suggests a kind of inherent resilience, doesn't it? Maybe that powerful will to not just survive, but to really thrive intellectually. That seemed to characterize his whole life. It certainly seems that way. But his early years weren't just about, physical frailty. There was significant emotional turmoil, too. He apparently deeply disliked his stepfather and really resented his mother after she remarried. He even listed as a childhood sin, threatening my father and Mother Smith to burn them and the house over them.
Goodness. That's quite a glimpse into a young mind, isn't it?
It really is.
It starkly contrasts with that image we have of the detached, rational scientist. It hints at a passionate inner world. And those early emotional experiences, they likely played a role in shaping his complex personality, maybe even fueled that intense focus he had later on.
You really have to wonder, how did that all play out? Anyway, moving to his education, he went to King's School in Grantham, learned Latin and Greek there.
Right, the classical foundation.
Which was probably pretty instrumental for his later work, including mathematics. But interestingly, his mother tried to make him a farmer. Total failure. He hated it.
Oh, the classic story of finding your true calling.
Pretty much.
His aversion to farming, it just underscores how important it is to recognize individual talents, even when, everyone's pushing you another way.
Definitely. Lucky for science, he went back to school, became a top student. And apparently part of the motivation was getting revenge on some bullies.
Huh, really?
Yeah. And he was already building things like sundials and little model windmills, channeling that mechanical fascination early on.
That competitive spirit, then, that drive to overcome challenges, maybe even settle scores. And it seems like a recurring theme for him. And those little models, they definitely foreshadow the practical, hands-on approach he took later.
Then came Cambridge, Trinity College in 1661. And initially, this is often overlooked, he was a subsizar, basically a paid servant.
Right, working his way through.
But his brilliance shone through pretty quickly, got a scholarship in 64, and even though the curriculum was still very much Aristotelian.
Yeah, that old system focused on observation, categorization, dominated for centuries.
Exactly. But Newton's mind was already grabbing onto the new stuff. Descartes' math, Galileo's astronomy, Kepler's work.
This was such a pivotal period, his intellectual awakening. He's absorbing all these cutting-edge ideas, questioning the old ways, and starting to forge his own path. Those philosophical questions he started keeping, that's him engaging with these new mechanical philosophies.
And the seeds were definitely being sown. By 1665, he'd already got the generalized binomial theorem worked out.
Which is a powerful tool,
And was already developing his method of fluxions, his first take on what we now call calculus.
Truly revolutionary leaps in math. The binomial theorem made handling complex algebra way easier, and those early calculus ideas, they were laying the groundwork for a whole new way to understand change in motion. Fundamental to physics.
Then a major turning point, the plague.
Yes, the annus mirabilis.
Exactly. Cambridge closed after he got his degree in August 65, so he retreats to Woolsthorpe, his family home, for 2 years of just intense independent study.
Incredible period.
And it was absolutely crucial, wasn't it, for his theories on calculus, optics, gravitation. Talk about a silver lining to a public health crisis.
It's really remarkable, such foundational work coming out of that period of isolation. It just shows the power of focused thought, when the usual distractions disappear. A key takeaway, really, how constraints can sometimes foster breakthroughs.
When he got back to Cambridge, his path seemed pretty set, Fellow of Trinity in 67.
A big step into the academic elite.
And then, just 2 years later, 1669, he succeeds Isaac Barrow as the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics.
Hugely prestigious. A position later held by people like Stephen Hawking. Shows Cambridge's commitment.
And his reputation was growing. Elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 72, the highest recognition, really, at the time.
Definitely. I mean, his work was seen as absolutely cutting edge in England.
Now, here's a fascinating hurdle Newton faced. As a Fellow at Trinity, he was actually required to take holy orders, become an ordained Anglican priest.
Oh, you have a standard.
But Newton held these deeply personal, quite unorthodox Christian beliefs, non-Trinitarian views specifically, which he kept very private. This could have completely derailed his career.
It really underscores that complex relationship between science and religion back then, doesn't it? Intellectual freedom wasn't absolute. Your personal beliefs could have massive professional consequences. If he'd been open about his theology, big trouble.
It really highlights something crucial about scientific progress, too. Sometimes external factors, like religious requirements, can be huge obstacles.
Absolutely. And the potential conflict was huge.
It's quite amazing how he navigated it. He actually managed to get special permission from King Charles II to avoid taking holy orders.
Wow. That suggests he already had considerable clout. Or maybe the crown just recognized his sheer brilliance and wanted to avoid a fuss.
Probably a bit of both.
It certainly speaks volumes, or perhaps just pragmatism from the monarchy. Protect the brilliant mind from religious dogma. Either way, a pivotal moment. It let his science proceed without being hindered by his personal faith.
Okay, let's dig into the mathematics then. It's widely agreed, isn't it, that Newton's work was just a major catalyst for everything that came after in math. His methods, those
It's
splotchen,
the early calculus, yeah.
first documented in a manuscript back in 1666.
Developing calculus was just monumental. A framework for understanding rates of change, areas,
Yeah.
essential tools for physics, engineering, you name it. That 66 manuscript was a landmark.
And his talent didn't go unnoticed. His predecessor, Isaac Barrow, saw it straight away.
Mm.
When Barrow sent Newton's paper on analysis by infinite series to John Collins in 69, he called the author an extraordinary genius.
High praise indeed. And coming from Barrow, a distinguished mathematician himself, that must have meant a lot. It really helped bring Newton to the attention of the wider community.
Of course, you can't talk Newton and calculus without mentioning Leibniz.
Ah, the priority dispute.
Yes.
Yes. Famous and rather unpleasant.
Right. The modern view is generally that they developed it independently, just using different notations. Newton was famously hesitant to publish.
Very much
The
so.
full description didn't really appear until 1704, whereas Leibniz started publishing in 1684.
And it's Leibniz's notation, interestingly, that largely won out in the end. Many find it more intuitive. But it really highlights that independent invention happens, and details like notation can have a huge impact.
Newton's presentation in the Principia, his big work, was mostly geometric, wasn't it? His method of first and last ratios.
Yes, which he said was equivalent to the earlier method of indivisibles. But you could argue the Principia itself is just, well, a massive book on infinitesimal calculus, as some have said.
That's a good way to put it. It wasn't just physics. The math framework was fundamental. His geometric approach might not be as easy to grasp initially as Leibniz's algebra, but it was incredibly rigorous for the time.
Absolutely groundbreaking.
And his reluctance to publish earlier seems it was partly that fear of controversy, of criticism.
He was known to be very sensitive to criticism, yes. The idea of getting into intellectual arguments probably made him cautious about sharing his methods widely.
He even had that friendship with the Swiss mathematician Nicolas Fatio de Duer, who started planning a new edition of the Principia but never finished it.
Right, that collaboration never quite happened. An intriguing what if in math history.
But the Leibniz dispute, it really escalated, didn't it? Around the turn of the 18th century, accusations of plagiarism flying back and forth.
Oh, it got nasty.
And then, in 1711, the Royal Society steps in. They investigate, declare Newton the first inventor, label Leibniz a fraud, and Newton secretly wrote the concluding remarks himself.
Yes, that part is, well, it shows a less flattering side of Newton. His fierce loyalty to his own work, maybe bordering on aggressive defense of his priority. A reminder that even geniuses have human frailties, right? especially under the pressure of competition.
That bitter feud went on until Leibniz died in 1716. A really unproductive episode.
It certainly cast a shadow and revealed a less admirable facet of Newton's character, definitely. His protectiveness, sometimes ruthless approach. It strained relationships.
But beyond calculus, monumental as it was, he did so much else mathematically. The generalized binomial theorem,
Newton's identities, Newton's method for finding roots.
classifying cubic plane curves, big contributions to finite difference theory, which is still important in numerical analysis.
And he was the first to really use fractional exponents and coordinate systems systematically to solve Diophantine equations, those integer solutions problems.
It just shows the incredible breadth and depth of his mathematical mind, doesn't it? He wasn't stuck in one area, he was pushing boundaries all over the place.
Truly remarkable range.
He even approximated sums of the harmonic series using logarithms, a precursor to Euler's summation formula. And he pioneered the confident use of power series, their inverses, inspired by Simon Stevens' earlier decimal work.
These advanced techniques massively expanded the mathematical toolkit of the time, laid groundwork for so much later analysis. His ability to connect different ideas was extraordinary.
It's interesting, going back to 67 when he became a fellow, he initially did commit to studying theology, even agreed to take holy orders, signed the 39 Articles twice.
Right. It underscores the expectations back then. Academia and religious life were often intertwined, especially in places like Cambridge.
But then his appointment as Lucasian professor in 69, thanks to Barrow, that created a conflict.
Because fellows usually had to be ordained priests.
Exactly. But the Lucasian chair had this unusual term exempting the holder from active church duties. And Newton cleverly argued for an exemption from ordination based on that clause. Got King Charles II's approval, too.
A critical moment. He basically prioritized his science over the traditional religious obligations. By skillfully getting that exemption, he cleared the path for his scientific work, unhindered by that potential clash with his private beliefs. A huge win for science, ultimately.
Let's switch gears now to optics. His work there was just as revolutionary, wasn't it? Starting around 1666.
Oh, absolutely. That prism experiment is iconic.
He noticed the spectrum of colors was always elongated, even with a circular beam of light. And that led him to conclude, quite radically, that color wasn't something the prism added to white light.
But that color was an intrinsic property of the light itself.
Exactly, a total shift from the common belief.
Such a simple observation, but so profound. It moved color from being a modification to being a fundamental component of white light.
And between 1670 and 72, he lectured on this, showed how you could recombine the spectrum with a second prism and lens back into white light.
Convincing demonstrations. And interestingly, some modern scholars see links between this light analysis and his alchemy studies.
Really? That's fascinating. How so?
Well, the idea of analyzing something into fundamental components and then resynthesizing it. There are parallels with alchemical transmutation ideas. It suggests maybe a more holistic worldview for Newton, where these different fields weren't totally separate in his mind.
Interesting. He also showed that if you isolate one color, say red light, and shine it on things, it stays red. It doesn't change properties.
Right.
So he concluded that the colors we see are because objects interact differently with the colored light that's already there. Objects don't create the color. That was his theory of color.
Another major paradigm shift. Color originates in the light, and how surfaces interact with its components, not in the object itself having some inherent color property.
And this understanding led him straight to a problem with telescopes, didn't it?
Yes, chromatic aberration. Because lenses refract different colors slightly differently, they focus them at different points, resulting in blurry images with color fringes around the edges.
A big limitation for those early refracting telescopes.
Severely hampered astronomical observations, yeah.
So to fix it, Newton designs and builds the first practical reflecting telescope, the Newtonian design, using mirrors instead of lenses.
A brilliant solution. But it meant tackling big engineering challenges, finding the right mirror material, figuring out how to shape it perfectly.
And he did it himself. Ground and polished mirrors from speculum metal, a custom alloy. Used Newton's rings, those interference patterns, to check the optical quality.
Just amazing. That blend of deep theoretical insight and practical craftsmanship, translating his optics knowledge into a working superior instrument, testament to his ingenuity. The reflecting telescope was a huge leap forward.
And that first one, late 1668, was tiny, about 8 inches long, but gave much clearer, more magnified images.
Sizes and everything.
Apparently not. Its demonstration to the Royal Society in 71 was a big success. And that prompted him to finally publish his notes as Of Colors, which later grew into the big one, Optics.
Yeah, the reception of the telescope and the encouragement he got were surely key in getting him to share those revolutionary optics discoveries more widely. Optics became a foundational text.
But publication brought controversy, especially with Robert Hooke.
Ah, Hooke again. Their relationship was complicated.
Hooke's criticisms led Newton to withdraw from public debate, as he often did. But they had a brief, somewhat tense correspondence in 1679-80. Hooke was the Royal Society's secretary then,
Right.
and he inadvertently pushed Newton back towards thinking about planetary motion. Specifically, proving elliptical orbits result from a centripetal force varying inversely with the square of the distance.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Go.
Hooke's attempts to engage Newton actually sparked some of Newton's biggest breakthroughs in mechanics,
Yeah.
despite their generally poor relationship, which lasted until Hooke died.
In optics, Newton argued light was made of tiny particles, corpuscles.
His corpuscular theory, yeah.
That got refracted because they accelerated when entering a denser medium. He did use wave-like ideas to explain some things, like the colors in thin films.
Those fits of easy reflection and transmission, he called them,
Mm.
a bit mysterious.
Right. But he mainly stuck to the particle view. Later, of course, wave theory became dominant, and now we have quantum mechanics wave-particle duality, which is quite different from Newton's picture.
But his corpuscular theory was hugely influential in its time. It explained reflection and refraction in a way that fit with his mechanical view of the world.
He even proposed an aether back in 1675 in his hypothesis of light as the medium for forces between these particles. But then after talking with the philosopher Henry Moore, his interest in alchemy got rekindled, and he started replacing the idea of a mechanical ether with, well, occult forces based on Hermetic ideas of attraction and repulsion between particles.
Which leads to that famous quote from John Maynard Keynes.
Not the first of the Age of Reason, he was the last of the magicians.
Exactly. It really highlights how intertwined his alchemy and science were. The lines we draw now just weren't there then.
And maybe that belief in occult action at a distance, through a vacuum, maybe that was actually crucial for him developing his theory of gravity.
It's very possible. The idea of a force acting across empty space was radical. Most mechanical philosophy relied on direct contact. Newton's willingness to entertain action at a distance, perhaps nurtured by his alchemy, was likely essential for that gravitational breakthrough.
When Optics was finally published in 1704, it detailed the corpuscular theory. And he even speculated in it about, gross bodies and light interconverting through alchemy, and whether bodies get their activity from light particles they absorb.
Shows a mind always probing the fundamental nature of matter and energy, venturing into areas that seem, well, outside physics to us now.
And just demonstrating his sheer curiosity, he also built a primitive electrostatic generator using a glass globe.
Right, dabbling in early electricity, too. Hands-on exploration of all sorts of phenomena.
And here's a truly amazing detail from Optics. It had the first diagram showing prisms used as beam expanders and in multiple prism arrays.
Okay.
Nearly 280 years later, those exact configurations became central to developing narrow line-width tunable lasers, led to the whole theory of multiple prism dispersion.
Wow, that's incredible. A seemingly minor detail having such a huge unforeseen impact centuries later shows the lasting power of his work.
Later physics, people like Young and Fresnel combined Newton's particle ideas with Huygens wave theory. That's when it became clear that color is the visible sign of light's wavelength.
Right, distinguishing the perception of color from the physics of light.
Even Goethe, the poet and scientist, critiqued Newton's color theory. Didn't overturn it, but pointed out Newton wrongly thought refraction without color was impossible, which made Newton think refracting telescopes would always be flawed.
And John Dollond later proved that wrong, didn't he? Creating achromatic lenses.
Exactly. It just shows how science progresses, right? Even Newton's monumental work gets refined, corrected. That back and forth between theory and experiment is key.
Absolutely. It's an iterative process.
Okay, let's turn to the big one, mechanics and gravity. Newton came back to celestial mechanics around 1679.
Prompted partly by that correspondence with Hooke, as we said.
And he started really thinking about gravity, how it affects planetary orbits, Kepler's laws. His interest was boosted by that comet in 1680-81 too. He corresponded with Flamsteed, the astronomer royal, about it.
Right, a period of renewed focus on the forces governing the cosmos. The exchanges with Hooke, however strained, were a catalyst.
So after sparring with Hooke, Newton sets out to prove mathematically that those elliptical orbits must result from a centripetal force when pulling towards the center that gets weaker with the square of the distance.
That was the crucial intellectual leap, wasn't it? Kepler described how planets moved. Newton wanted to explain why. The inverse square law.
He sent his findings to Edmund Halley and the Royal Society in 1684. Just a short manuscript, 9 pages, called De Motu Corporum in Gyrum, on the motion of bodies in an orbit.
But those 9 pages were revolutionary. They laid the groundwork for the masterpiece, the Principia.
Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, published July 5, 1687. And we really have Edmund Halley to thank for pushing him and even funding it.
Halley's role was absolutely crucial. Without his encouragement and financial backing, the Principia might never have seen the light of day.
And inside, the 3 universal laws of motion, describing the relationship between objects, forces, motion, the foundation of classical mechanics.
Just immense. It fueled the Industrial Revolution, dominated physics for over 200 years, and much of it is still fundamental for everyday technology.
Its impact is almost impossible to overstate. A unified framework for understanding motion, both here on Earth and in the heavens. Revolutionary.
Truly unparalleled intellectual power and scope.
And in the Principia, he used the Latin word gravitas, meaning weight, for the effect we now call gravity, establishing the law of universal gravitation.
The very idea of a universal force between all masses. That was radical. A single explanation for falling apples and orbiting planets. Elegant, coherent.
His analysis of orbits in the Principia used that geometric approach, his method of first and last ratios, similar to his calculus. But it wasn't just orbits.
No, the breadth was astonishing.
First, analytical derivation of the speed of sound in air, based on Boyle's law, deduced the Earth's flattening at the poles due to rotation.
Explain the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis as due to the moon's gravity pulling on the equatorial bulge.
Started studying the irregularities in the moon's motion, offered a theory for comet orbits. Just incredible scope.
It definitively showed the power and universality of his laws. Just staggering what he managed to explain within that single framework.
He also clarified his heliocentric view in the Principia. By the mid-1680s, he realized the sun isn't perfectly still at the center.
Right, the center of mass idea. The sun wobbles slightly because of the planet's gravity.
For Newton, the real center was the common center of gravity of the Earth, the sun, and all the planets, which he thought was either at rest or moving uniformly through space.
Such a nuanced, precise understanding shows his commitment to accuracy, recognizing the complexity even in seemingly fixed points.
But this idea of an invisible force acting across empty space, it didn't sit well with everyone.
No, the criticism was immediate. Accusations of bringing occult qualities, hidden influences back into science.
So in the second edition of the Principia, 1713, he hit back in the famous General Scholium, famously stating, "Hypotheses non fingo. I feign no hypotheses."
Basically saying, look, I've described how gravity works mathematically. I've shown its effects match observations. Why it works, its ultimate cause, I don't know. And I don't need to frame speculative hypotheses about it.
Exactly. Stick to the empirical evidence and the math, a cornerstone of his scientific method.
Perfectly encapsulates his approach. Observation and mathematical description were paramount.
And the Principia, of course, brought him instant worldwide fame. Huge admiration from scholars everywhere, including that Swiss mathematician, Fatio Dulier.
It cemented his reputation as one of history's greatest scientific minds. Its impact resonated everywhere and laid the groundwork for generations of physicists and astronomers.
On a slightly different mathematical track, but still impressive, in 1710, he identified 72 out of 78 kinds of cubic plane curves, categorized them into 4 types. And later, James Stirling, probably with Newton's help, proved every cubic curve fits into one of those 4 types.
Shows his sustained engagement with pure math beyond physics applications, foundational work in algebraic geometry.
Newton even guessed that these 4 types could all be generated by projection from just one of them. That was proven in 1731, just after he died.
Remarkable foresight.
Now, his later life. In the 1690s, he spent a lot of time writing on religion, interpreting scripture literally and symbolically.
Right, a significant shift towards theological work.
He sent a manuscript to John Locke questioning the authenticity of a passage in 1 John, the Johannine comma, which was often used to support the Trinity. It wasn't published until 1785, long after his death.
Fascinating. Shows his deep engagement with questions of faith, biblical interpretation, extending beyond science.
He also served briefly in Parliament for Cambridge University, twice.
1689 and 1701.
Anecdotes suggest he didn't say much. The famous story is him just complaining about a draft and asking for a window to be closed.
Huh. Probably apocryphal, but amusing.
Though another account mentions him telling off students for scaring locals with ghost stories.
So maybe not totally silent. But it seems politics was more a civic duty tied to his position than a real passion.
Then, in 1696, a big career change. Moves to London, becomes Warden of the Royal Mint.
Appointed through his patron, Charles Montague, Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Right. He oversaw the huge task of England's recoinage, even got Haley a temporary job there, shows his practical side moving into governance.
A major transition from academia to the demanding world of finance and public administration. Restoring the currency was a massive undertaking.
And he got promoted in 1699 to Master of the Mint after Thomas Neal died. Held that post for the last 30 years of his life.
Wow, a long tenure.
And it wasn't just a ceremonial role for him. He took it incredibly seriously. Left Cambridge completely in 1701, used his authority to reform the currency, and went after counterfeiters hammer and tongs.
He brought that same intense focus and meticulousness from his science to his administrative duties, clearly saw it as a major public responsibility.
As warden and then master, he estimated something like 20% of the money being recoined in 96 was counterfeit, which was high treason.
A huge problem.
And he was remarkably effective in tackling it, despite the difficulty of convicting powerful criminals. He even gathered evidence himself, apparently went undercover in bars and taverns.
No way. Newton the detective.
Seems like it. He became a justice of the peace for the surrounding counties, personally cross-examined over 100 suspects and witnesses between 1698 and 99, successfully prosecuted 28 counterfeiters.
That's incredible. Shows a really determined, maybe even obsessive side. His commitment to rooting out corruption was intense. Almost like a detective story, as you say.
His scientific standing kept growing too. Elected president of the Royal Society in 1703, also made a member of the French Academy of Sciences.
Peak recognition.
But his time as president wasn't all smooth sailing. He clashed badly with Flamsteed, the astronomer royal.
Ah, yes, the publication dispute.
Newton prematurely published Flamsteed's star catalogue, Historia Coelestis Britannica, which he'd used for his own research, made Flamsteed furious.
Yeah, highlights Newton's sometimes difficult personal relationships, especially when his own work or priorities were involved. A less harmonious aspect, certainly, perhaps overly assertive in using data, even at the expense of courtesy.
Queen Anne knighted him in April 1705 during a visit to Trinity College.
Sir Isaac Newton.
But the timing suggests it might have been partly political, linked to an upcoming election, not just for his science or mint service, still only the second scientist knighted after Francis Bacon.
Shows that intersection of science, politics, and patronage again. Undeniably worthy, but politics likely played a role in the timing.
Then there's his work on the gold-silver ratio. In 1717, he made recommendations to the Treasury that led to a royal proclamation.
Which effectively put Britain on a gold standard.
Right. It altered the ratio, inadvertently caused a silver shortage as silver flowed out for imports and gold came in. Whether he fully intended that outcome is debated by economic historians.
A profound impact on the British economy, regardless.
And some even suggest Newton saw his mint work as connected to his alchemy, understanding the true nature and value of metals.
A fascinating possible link between his seemingly separate intellectual worlds.
And even Newton wasn't immune to financial speculation. He invested in the South Sea Company.
Oh dear. The South Sea bubble.
And lost a fortune when it collapsed around 1720. About £20,000, which was enormous then, millions in today's money.
A stark reminder that brilliance in one area doesn't guarantee success in finance. Susceptible to market manias like anyone else.
In his later years, he lived partly at Cranberry Park near Winchester with his niece Catherine Barton and her husband John Conduit. Catherine was also his hostess in London. Apparently he was a very loving uncle to her. Nice to hear those personal touches.
Yeah, it adds a human dimension to the image of the genius. Shows his capacity for family ties later in life.
Speaking of personal life,
Yeah.
he famously never married.
Right. Lots of speculation about that.
Voltaire, who was in London for Newton's funeral, wrote that Newton was never sensible to any passion, nor had any commerce with women. Led to the widespread belief he died a virgin. Commented on by everyone from mathematicians to economists to Carl Sagan.
His celibacy definitely adds to the mystique, whether it was choice, intense focus on work or something else. It contributes to that legendary aura.
He did have that intense friendship with Nicolas Fadio de Dulier, the Swiss mathematician, starting around 1689.
Yes, their correspondence suggests a real connection.
But it ended abruptly, inexplicably, in 1693, and that coincided with Newton having some kind of nervous breakdown.
A very difficult period for him.
He sent delusional, accusatory letters to friends like Samuel Pepys and John Locke. It's a reminder of the immense pressure he must have been under. The end of the friendship with Dulier might have been a factor or maybe a symptom.
A poignant reminder that even the greatest minds face human vulnerabilities, the strain of relentless intellectual work. The end of that friendship likely added to the stress.
And more recently, people like the physicist Steven Weinberg didn't mince words about his character, called him nasty, mean as a snake as an enemy.
Particularly regarding Hooke and Leibniz.
Seems his brilliance didn't always translate to kindness or, let's say, fair play in scientific disputes.
It's important to acknowledge those less flattering sides. His competitiveness, his sometimes ruthless defensive priority. It definitely strained relationships.
Isaac Newton died in his sleep in London, March 20th, 1726 by the old calendar, March 31st, 1727 for us.
A peaceful end.
He received a grand state funeral, buried in Westminster Abbey, a huge honor showing his national importance. Voltaire might even have been there.
His burial there, alongside kings and queens, speaks volumes about the reverence he commanded by them.
He died a bachelor, gave away much of his estate to relatives beforehand, but died intestate without a will. His papers went to his niece Catherine and her husband. And interestingly, hair analysis later found high levels of mercury.
From the Alchemy, presumably.
Yeah, very likely, leading to speculation it might have contributed to his eccentricities later in life.
An intriguing possibility. Adds another layer of the potential physical cost of his alchemical experiments.
After his death, the tributes just poured in. Lagrange called him the greatest genius ever and the most fortunate, for we cannot find more than once a system of the world to establish.
High praise indeed.
And Alexander Pope's famous epitaph, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light."
Just perfectly captures this transformative impact, doesn't it? He really did usher in a new era of understanding.
Newton himself, though, often sounded more modest. That famous line to Hooke in 1676, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants."
Yes. Debated whether it was sincere or a sarcastic jab at Hooke, who might have been short and hunchbacked.
Given their rivalry, maybe a bit of both. But the proverb was already known, suggesting maybe Newton saw himself as building on others' work.
Regardless of the intent, it's a powerful reminder about the cumulative nature of science. Each generation builds on the last.
And in a later memoir, he compared himself to a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me.
Beautiful image. Shows his humility, his recognition of how much was still unknown, even after all his discoveries.
Then there's the truly bizarre story. In 1816, a tooth, supposedly Newton's, sold for 730 pounds. Yeah, a huge sum then. An aristocrat bought it and had it set in a ring. Guinness World Records listed it as the most valuable tooth. Who bought it and where it is now? Unknown.
That's extraordinary and slightly gruesome. Speaks to the almost relic-like status his remains acquired.
And the respect continued. Einstein kept Newton's picture on his study wall alongside Faraday and Maxwell.
Wow. Giants acknowledging giants.
Polls still debate his influence versus Einstein's. A 2005 Royal Society poll put Newton first for influence. A 99 physicists poll put Einstein first as greatest physicist, Newton second. A physics web poll put Newton first again.
Highlights the ongoing recognition of both their immense revolutionary impacts. They reshaped physics in different ways, addressing different fundamental questions.
And of course, the SI unit of force is the Newton, a fitting, permanent tribute.
Absolutely. His laws of motion are still fundamental.
Numerous monuments exist, too. That impressive one in Westminster Abbey finished 1731 with all the symbols of his achievements. His portrait was on the Bank of England £1 note for a decade. Statues at Oxford's Natural History Museum, the British Library Piazza.
They reflect that enduring cultural and scientific significance. He continues to inspire awe.
Okay, let's dive into his religious views, which were complex. Born Anglican, but by his 30s, held beliefs considered deeply unorthodox, even heretical.
Right. He started detailed theological studies around 1672, kept them very private.
Showed deep knowledge of early church writings. And in those big debates about the Trinity, like Athanasius versus Arius, Newton sided with Arius.
Who rejected the traditional Trinity, seeing Christ as subordinate to God the Father.
Exactly. Newton saw Christ as a divine mediator, but created by and subordinate to the Father. He's fascinated by prophecy, but saw the Trinity itself as the great apostasy.
His theology was extensive, personal, and a significant break from orthodoxy. Rejecting the Trinity, a core doctrine, shows that independent contrarian streak again, beyond just science.
And his struggles to get exempted from holy orders finally succeeding in 1675 for the Lucasian professors. It underlines that tension between his private beliefs and public requirements.
He saw worshiping Christ as God as idolatry, a fundamental sin.
The historian Stephen Snowbelin put it well. Isaac Newton was a heretic, but he never made a public declaration. He concealed his faith so well that scholars are still unraveling his personal beliefs. Snowbelin thought he was Socinian-leaning, possibly Arian, definitely anti-Trinitarian.
Keeping those beliefs secret for so long highlights the risks back then. Carefully maneuvering to avoid ordination was crucial for his career and freedom.
There is a minority view that he was maybe closer to semi-Arianism Christ, of similar substance to the Father, not same substance, but most scholars now, based on his writings, see him as an anti-Trinitarian monotheist.
That seems the consensus, yeah.
But despite his laws, he warned against seeing the universe as just a machine, like a clock.
Right. He thought gravity could move the planets, but couldn't have set them in those stable, near-circular orbits initially without divine power.
His theology and science were intertwined. He saw the cosmos' order as evidence of a divine architect.
Deeply integrated views. The universe's intricacy pointed to a creator for him.
His biblical studies were as serious as his science. Wrote on textual criticism, like an historical account of two notable corruptions of Scripture, and on prophecy in Daniel and Revelation. He even calculated the date of the crucifixion as April 3rd, AD 33, matching traditional dates. He believed in a rational, ordered world, but rejected hylotheism, the idea that all matter has life, which Leibniz and Spinoza hinted at.
For Newton, the order showed the universe was understandable by reason, pointing to an active intelligence behind it.
He explicitly said his aim in the Principia was to offer principles that might work with considering men to believe a deity. Saw design in the wonderful uniformity in the planetary system.
Compelling evidence for an intelligent and powerful being, in his view.
But controversially, he also thought God would eventually need to intervene to reset the system because of accumulating instabilities.
Which drew that famous jab from Leibniz about God needing to wind his watch.
Right. Leibniz argued a perfect creator wouldn't need to keep tinkering.
That debate, carried on by followers like Samuel Clarke for Newton, highlights the evolving views on divine intervention.
And a century later, Laplace's Mécanique Céleste offered a natural explanation for the solar system's stability, seemingly without needing divine adjustments, leading to Laplace's famous reply to Napoleon about not needing the God hypothesis.
A significant shift towards purely naturalistic explanations. The Newton-Leibniz debate marked a key point in that evolution.
This scholarly debate on whether Newton explicitly rejected the Trinity continues. His early biographer, Brewster, who saw the manuscripts, argued Newton just questioned certain proof texts, not the doctrine itself.
But later analysis, especially the papers Keynes collected, revealed his actual rejection quite clearly, didn't it?
Yes, the deciphering of those private papers has been crucial. Showed beliefs he clearly felt he had to hide during his lifetime.
The ongoing study keeps shedding light on his complex, concealed theology.
Now, Newton's influence on religious thought during the Enlightenment was huge. His mechanical philosophy, along with Boyle's, was promoted by rationalists as an alternative to pantheism or religious enthusiasm.
Even embraced, cautiously, by some preachers, like the latitudinarians.
The clarity and simplicity of science seemed a way to combat both superstition and atheism. And that second wave of English natural theology used Newton's discoveries directly as evidence for a natural religion based on reason and observation.
His science provided a powerful foundation for the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and natural law, shaping theological debates about God and the universe based on its perceived order and design.
And the attacks on pre-Enlightenment magical thinking or mysticism in Christianity, they were grounded in that mechanistic view. Boyle laid the groundwork. Newton provided the mathematical proof and popularization.
His work was key in that shift towards a more rational, mechanistic worldview, contributing to a decline in supernatural explanations.
What about that prediction of 2060? You hear that sometimes.
Yes. That comes from an unpublished 1704 manuscript. often misinterpreted as predicting the end of the world.
But it wasn't that, was it?
No. In context, he was doing complex calculations based on prophecies in the book of Daniel, the time and times and a half a time. He linked it to the fall of Babylon, the rise of papal power, and projected 1,260 years forward from around 800 AD.
So, more a calculation based on his interpretation of prophecy, not a doomsday prediction.
Exactly. And he explicitly resisted setting dates for the end times, worried failed predictions would discredit Christianity. He believed Christ would return unexpectedly as a thief in the night, and the timing was God's alone.
Shows his deep dive into biblical prophecy, trying to find rational patterns, but also his caution about definitive predictions.
Demonstrates both his fascination with finding a logical framework in Scripture and a responsible reluctance to overstate his findings.
Okay, finally, let's tackle alchemy.
The last magician aspect.
Fritz Leiber's quote is great. Everyone knows Newton the scientist. If you remember, he spent half his life studying alchemy. That was the pebble by the seashore he really wanted to find.
And it's true, a huge amount of his writing, maybe 1,000,000 words, was on alchemy.
A lot of it copying manuscripts, adding his own notes, experimental observations.
Right, and those alchemical texts combined practical lab work with philosophy, often veiled in allegory and symbolism to protect secrets. Some of it might have been seen as heretical, too.
His deep involvement in alchemy is definitely one of the most intriguing parts of his life. Challenges that purely rational image.
It really does. Forces us to see him in the context of his time, where those boundaries weren't so clear.
And the story of his papers is fascinating, too. Cambridge kept some, returned most to his family in 1888, then they were auctioned off in 1936.
Broken up, sold for about £9,000 total.
But John Maynard Keynes bought a lot of the alchemical papers, reassembled about half, and donated them back to Cambridge.
Thank goodness for Keynes.
And now, remarkably, all his known alchemical writings are online through Indiana University's Chemistry of Isaac Newton project.
Which allows for a much more complete understanding now.
So while we celebrate the science gravity, optics, calculus, his 30 years of largely hidden alchemy or chemistry was a huge integral part of his life and work.
Absolutely. The dispersal and reassembly story itself shows how ambivalent history has been about acknowledging that side of him.
Though some, like the historian Gillespie, argued he didn't really practice alchemy traditionally, that his chemistry was more in line with Boyle's corpuscular ideas.
There's debate on the nature of his involvement.
But then, in 2020, some unpublished notes of his on Van Helmont's book about the plague were auctioned, written during the plague years 1665-66.
Okay.
And in them, discussing a remedy, Newton recorded this procedure. The best is a toad suspended by the legs in a chimney for 3 days, which at last vomited up earth with diverse venomous spots, which toad powder mingled with the excrement and serum made into lozenges and worn about the affected place drives away the contagion.
Wow, that's specific. And certainly sounds like engagement with the more practical and perhaps stranger aspects of medical theories back then. Goes beyond pure philosophy.
Definitely suggests more than just armchair interest. The debate continues, but it shows the complexity, the challenge of fitting historical figures into neat modern boxes.
Exactly. We need to understand them in their own context, not just ours.
Moving towards his legacy, the Enlightenment philosophers really picked Newton, along with Galileo and Boyle, as key figures, guides for applying natural law concepts to everything.
Right, sometimes discarding other historical lessons in the process.
Newton's idea of a universe run by understandable rational laws became foundational for Enlightenment ideology. Locke and Voltaire applied natural law to politics and rights.
The physiocrats and Adam Smith applied natural concepts of psychology and self-interest to economics.
Early sociologists tried fitting history into natural, progressive models. Even those who disagreed with parts of Newton's work, like Mombato or Samuel Clarke, often tried to fit his findings into their own religious views of nature.
His work became this incredibly powerful model, emphasizing reason, natural law, influencing philosophy, politics, economics, far beyond physics.
And finally, the apple, the iconic story.
Can't talk Newton without the apple.
He often told the story himself, being inspired about gravity by seeing an apple fall. Popularized probably through his niece Catherine Barton talking to Voltaire.
Voltaire wrote about it in 1727, Newton seeing the apple fall in his garden, sparking the idea.
Now, it's often seen as just a neat anecdote, maybe oversimplified. Gravity wasn't a single aha moment.
Of course not. Decades of work involved.
But people who knew him, like William Stukeley, did corroborate the incident. Stukely wrote about a conversation in 1726 where Newton recalled the idea of gravity extending beyond Earth coming to him as he watched an apple fall, wondering why it always fell straight down towards the Earth's center.
So not necessarily hitting him on the head, but the falling apple as a trigger for contemplation.
Right. And John Conduit, his assistant and niece's husband, described it similarly. Newton reflecting in the garden in 66, realizing the force pulling the apple down might reach all the way to the moon, keeping it in orbit, then starting the calculations.
His notebooks show he was grappling with terrestrial gravity extending to the moon with an inverse square law by the late 1660s. But it took 2 decades to fully develop the theory.
The key wasn't just if gravity existed, but did it reach far enough and act in the right way to hold the moon? He showed that if it decreased as the inverse square of distance, you could calculate the moon's orbit accurately, and then surmise the same force applied everywhere, universal gravitation.
The apple story, literal or not, is just such a powerful symbol of that scientific insight, right? Seen profound implications in everyday events.
Absolutely. And people still argue over which tree was the tree. King's School claimed they had it, moved from the original spot. Woolsthorpe Manor, his birthplace, says no, the tree in their orchard is the one.
Huh. The battle of the apple trees.
A descendant of the Woolsthorpe tree grows outside Trinity College, Cambridge, below Newton's old rooms. And you can even get grafts from the National Fruit Collection. Apparently, it's a Kentish cooking apple variety.
Provides that tangible link to the legend, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A reminder of that simple observation sparking a revolution.
His body of work is just immense. The Principia, Optics, De Analysi, De Motu, System of the World, optical lectures, plus the theological works, chronology of ancient kingdoms, observations on Daniel, mathematical works published later like Method of Fluxions, the Corruptions of Scripture account, just staggering output.
Truly monumental, spanning and profoundly shaping math, physics, optics, theology, an extraordinary intellectual legacy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Isaac Newton,
Oh.
wow, we've covered an immense scope, haven't we? So many surprising nuances, way beyond just gravity and calculus.
Absolutely. His story really shows the interconnectedness of everything for him. The science, the math, the theology, even the alchemy. That last magician idea Keynes had offers such an illuminating perspective on his whole era.
Yeah, his life reveals this fascinating, complex tapestry where seemingly different fields were all part of his quest for understanding.
Definitely.
From that troubled, intense childhood, the secret religious beliefs, that blend of rigorous science and esoteric alchemy, he emerges as just profoundly complex.
A figure of remarkable intellectual contradictions, wasn't he? Revolutionary in some ways, yet holding on to traditional, even mystical beliefs in others.
And the apple story may be embellished over time, but it's still such a potent symbol of that fundamental shift in understanding the universe.
Perfectly captures it. Simple observation, profound curiosity, unlocking nature's secrets.
And maybe the final thought for us, and for you listening, is just to consider the enduring impact of a mind like that. Someone who could revolutionize cosmology with math and delve deep into alchemy and biblical prophecy simultaneously. What does that tell us about genius, about the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms, the relationship between the material and the mystical?
It's a profound question, isn't it? Something to really mull over long after this deep dive ends.